Plato's Allegory of the Cave is the most famous passage in Western philosophy, and for 2,500 years it has haunted the Western imagination. Alfred North Whitehead once said that the entire European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. This small parable lies at its heart. The questions it raises: what is real, what is good, how should we live, what is the soul, and what is its destiny, are the questions at the root of philosophy, theology, and science, and the questions that gave birth to Western civilization. Written around 375 BC in the seventh book of his masterwork, The Republic, it is presented as the words of Socrates, though whether the parable originated with Socrates, was Plato's own invention, or draws from some older and more ancient source that Plato gave his own form to, we cannot say with certainty. It describes the human condition through a single, unforgettable image: prisoners chained in an underground cave, watching shadows on a wall, believing those shadows to be reality. The idea at its heart is simple, yet profoundly disturbing: that the reality we live in is not the true reality, that we are, as we are born, prisoners, chained in our own ignorance, watching shadows and mistaking them for the world, and that we do not know we are prisoners until, by some grace or some effort, we turn around, break our chains, and begin the long, painful ascent toward the light. This allegory is a foundational parable for the path we walk. We are born into the cave and we are called to the light. The ascent from darkness to truth is the deepest purpose of a human life. For what would it profit you to gain the world yet lose your soul, especially if the soul is real and the world is not? Here is the allegory of the cave. And now, allow me to draw a comparison in order to show how far nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Imagine that there are people living in a cave deep underground. The cavern has a mouth that opens toward the daylight above, and a long passage leads from this all the way down to the people. They have lived here from childhood with their legs and necks bound in chains. They cannot move. All they can do is stare directly forward, for the chains prevent them from turning their heads around. Far above and behind them a great fire blazes. Between this fire and the captives, a low wall is erected along a raised path, something like the screen that puppeteers use to conceal themselves during their shows. Along this wall, other people carry all sorts of objects back and forth. Images of men and animals carved in stone and wood and other materials, which appear over the top of the wall. Some of these people are talking, others are silent. This is a strange image, and these are strange prisoners, and yet they are very much like us. Tell me, is it possible that these captives ever saw anything of themselves or of one another, other than the shadows cast upon the cavern wall before them? How could they, since from birth they are held with their heads facing forward only? And of the objects being carried behind them, they would see only the shadows. And if they could speak to one another, would they not suppose that the names they gave to those shadows applied to real things? And if a sound reverberated through the cavern from one of those passing behind the wall, would not the captives suppose that the passing shadow itself had made the sound? Undoubtedly, such captives would consider the truth to be nothing but the shadows of those carved objects. Now consider what would happen if the captives were released from their chains and cured of their ignorance. Imagine that one of them is set free from his shackles and compelled suddenly to stand up, to turn around, to walk, and to look toward the light. All of this would be painful, and the glare of the fire would make him unable to see the objects whose shadows he had formerly beheld. What would he say if someone informed him that everything he had known before was illusion and delusion, but that now he was nearer to reality, turned toward things more real, and able to see more truly? And if someone directed his attention to the figures passing along the wall, and asked him to name them, would he not be at a loss? Would he not believe that the shadows he formerly knew were more real than the objects now being shown to him? And if someone forced him to look directly at the firelight, would his eyes not burn? Would he not turn away and flee back to those things he was accustomed to seeing, convinced that they were clearer and more real than what was now being shown to him? Now imagine that someone, using force, were to drag him up the rough and steep ascent out of the cave and not let go until he had been pulled out to the light of the sun. Would he not feel, in the process, pain and rage? And when he stood at last in the sunlight, would his eyes not be overwhelmed by the glare, so that he was unable to see any of the things now revealed to him as real? Not all at once, he would need time. It would take a process of growing accustomed to the sight of the upper world. At first he would most easily see shadows, then reflections of people and things in water, then the things themselves. And then he would behold the heavens and the heavens themselves by night, seeing the light of the stars and the moon with greater ease than the sun and its light by day. And then at last he would be able to gaze upon the sun itself, not as reflected in water, nor as a phantom image in some other place, but as it is in itself in its own proper place, and contemplate it as it truly is. And now he would begin to reason. He would find that the sun is the source of the seasons and the years, the governor of all things in the visible world, and in a certain way the cause of all things that he and his fellow captives had been accustomed to behold. And when he remembered his old dwelling and what passed for wisdom there, and his fellow prisoners, would he not consider himself fortunate for the transformation and feel pity for them? Now suppose there were honors and prizes among the captives, which they awarded to one another for being the best at recognizing the shadows as they passed by, for best remembering which came first and which followed after, and which appeared together, and for being best at predicting which shadow would come next. Do you think the man who had been liberated would care for such honors or envy those who received them? Would he not, rather, as Homer says, prefer to be the humble serf of a landless man and to endure anything rather than hold the opinions of the captives and live as they do? He would rather suffer anything than return to that life. And now consider this. If this man who had escaped the cave were to go back down again and take his old seat, would he not find, coming suddenly out of the sunlight, that his eyes were filled with darkness? And if once again he had to engage in the business of interpreting the shadows with those who had remained chained there, while his eyes were still weak and before they had readjusted, which might take considerable time, would he not be ridiculous to them? Would they not say that he had gone up only to come back with his eyes ruined, and that it was not worth even thinking about the ascent? And if anyone tried to free them from their chains and lead them up to the light, if they could get hold of this person, would they not kill him? The underground cave is the visible world. The fire within it is the sun we see. And you will not misunderstand me if you interpret the ascent out of the cave to be the ascent of the soul into the intelligible world. This is what I believe, though heaven alone knows whether it is true. But whether true or false, this is how it appears to me. In the realm of what can be known, the idea of the good is discovered last of all, and it is perceived only with great difficulty. But when it is seen, it leads directly to the finding that it is the universal cause of all that is right and beautiful, that in the visible world it is the source of light and the master of the same, and in the intelligible world it is the master and source of truth and reason. And whoever would act wisely in private or in public life must keep this idea in focus. We should not be surprised that those who have reached this height are unwilling to occupy themselves with the mundane affairs of men. Their souls always feel a calling, always toward the higher things. And one who has his wits about him would remember that there are two causes that trouble the eyes: the transition from darkness into light, and the transition from light back into darkness. Considering that the soul undergoes the same, he would not laugh at a confused soul without first asking whether it was descending from a brighter world and blinded by the darkness, or ascending from ignorance into the light and overwhelmed by the radiance. One condition he would call fortunate, the other he would pity. And know this, the ability and means of seeing is already present within the soul. As the eye cannot turn from darkness to light unless the whole body turns with it, so the soul can turn from the world of becoming to the world of being by a movement of the whole soul. It must learn by degrees to endure the contemplation of being and of the most radiant region of being which we call the good. Therefore there must be a craft of some kind, a most efficient and effective means of turning the soul. Not an art that gives the soul its vision, for it already has that, but a craft that works under the understanding that the soul possesses its own innate vision, yet does not direct it rightly. This craft must bring about the turning. Such a craft must exist.